Hi, I'm Selena. Welcome to my classics wrap-up for the month of October. So this month I read 3 classics so far. I don't think any will sneak in before the end of the month, and so I feel comfortable filming this now. But if one happens to before the time that I post this, I'm filming this on a Sunday, it's gonna go up on a Thursday, then I will add a clip in at the end. But for now, I have got 3 classics to talk to you about, and they are in 2 different genres. One of the classics that I read was Gothic horror, and then 2 of the classics that I read were both technically fantasy, but they were very different types of fantasy. And the first classic that I'm going to talk to you about is a classic that I've already talked about several times on my channel, and that is Carmilla. So I gave Carmilla 5 stars. I loved this book so much. So backstory, I actually watched the Carmilla web series like a few years ago, back when I was in high school. I watched the first season at least. I don't know if any more was out at that time. I'm sure there was actually, but I didn't continue it for whatever reason. And then like 2 years ago, I actually watched it again up until a point in season 2, and then I had to get surgery, and so I kind of stopped watching that at that point. So I haven't finished the web series, but I already knew the basic premise of Carmilla kind of from that web series. The web series is a retelling, and it is a modern spin on it, and it does like kind of go off away from the book a lot. But I knew that that web series was based off of something, and I'd wanted to vaguely read that for a while, and then I recently, fast forward to now, I recently am in a fantasy class, and in that class we read this classic. So Carmilla is a Gothic horror novella in Sheridan Le Fanu's In a Glass Darkly. This is his short story collection called In a Glass Darkly, where he has 5 sort of Gothic tales in it, I believe, and Carmilla is one of 5. And so I didn't read the whole thing, but I did read Carmilla, which is right here. It's a novella, so it's like only like that long, but I loved it so much. So this is a vampire novella that you will not expect. It subverts a lot of the tropes that we associate with traditional vampire novellas or stories in general, I guess. But it managed to do that and be that while being one of the first vampire things to get a lot of ground, and one of the ones that we still read today. And so I guess I do think it subverted tropes of vampires in a way, because the lore of vampire existed, and Sheridan Le Fanu kind of came up with his own version of vampires while taking a lot from the lore. But he managed to, if you are tired of the sick and tired of the tropes of a lot of the later vampire works, then you might like Carmilla, because this one had a lot of things that I was not expecting, or I would think that someone else wouldn't expect if they had never heard of this book before and just knew vampire novella. I also know that this novella may have inspired Dracula. It didn't inspire Dracula like directly, but a lot of scholars have seen similarities in the way that Carmilla is and the way that Dracula is, and so there's not a lot of evidence, but like we have some reason to believe that Bram Stoker read Carmilla as well as The Vampire by someone, I don't know, I'll have it on the screen. Okay, so I'm gonna give a warning right here, because from this point on I am gonna go into a little bit more of spoilers about how Carmilla's tropes are subverted. I'll put timestamps in the description. I always have timestamps in the description, and if you would like to skip around to the various classics, skip past the spoilers, just skip past the spoilers, go to the next classic, and we will see you in a second, I guess. So to me, Carmilla is a lot about the anxieties of the Victorian period, like regarding female friendship and queerness and sexuality, and how the least scary thing to a Victorian was often a like timid sort of woman, like a white, dainty, like a pretty little high-class woman is probably the least threatening thing to Victorians. And so by having Carmilla be that, and also be so sinister, people don't see her coming in this, and they just don't even, it's more than that though, they don't even see it in the realm of possibility for her to be sinister at all. And so when people, if you would have said like, hey, this young teen rich girl is, you know, like she's kind of sinister, then no one would have believed you. I got that sort of vibe with it. But also I do think that because of the friendship that Carmilla makes with the girls that she bites, like Laura, our main character, tells us, they get very intense very quickly. And they have this sort of romantic element to them, even if the girls don't really recognize it as such, or even if they're like, oh, this is wrong, there is a sort of really intense bond that seems to be somewhat romantic. And then to have Carmilla need a kind of consent for that bond to form in order to then begin feeding is also kind of an interesting subversion of the vampire trope. Like, often vampires, blood-sucking is seen as a kind of sexual violation, but in this book it was kind of seen as something Carmilla needed permission to do, and how she got that permission was forming these really close bonds with these girls, almost like they couldn't really help it. And then to see that bond kind of persist after the ending was really interesting. And it kind of shows how people may have had these ideas, like, what if female friendship goes bad, or what if it goes too far, or the anxieties around that. So that's what it felt like to me, and I thought that was really interesting to read, to see happen. This is definitely one of my favorite Gothic novels, definitely my favorite Gothic horror or novella, and oh my goodness, I love this so much. It is probably one of my new favorites, definitely one of my new favorite Gothics, definitely one of my new favorite classics. I love this book so much, and it was such a treat to read. I highly recommend it if it sounds like your thing. The next book I read was The Fellowship of the Ring. So this is technically a reread because I read this when I was much younger. I was like 14 years old. I had just read The Hobbit for school, and I asked for the whole box set for Christmas because, I don't know, I'd heard that Lord of the Rings was good. I thought The Hobbit was all right, and so I tried them out. And I was 14, and I wasn't really into much reading other than like Harry Potter or Percy Jackson. And I was just like rereading my favorites. I wasn't really into the same things I am now. Hadn't read very many classics at all. And so this was a really big undertaking for me. I hadn't read that much high fantasy as well. And so I didn't appreciate this. I didn't enjoy it very much upon my first reread. I always knew that I wanted to give them another go at some point, but I didn't know when that would be. But I decided recently to do that, and it was such a good experience. Before, Tolkien's writing had seemed kind of hard to parse, kind of difficult, old, but now that I read classics and love that old writing like Jane Austen, this writing was a lot easier for me to read, and it was a lot more beautiful. Like, I was really able to appreciate Tolkien's prose and the thought he put into it, and just the way he would say things. And I really enjoyed reading this writing. Everyone knows this about Lord of the Rings, but it has such an expansive and beautiful world, and the way that Tolkien presents it is also just so beautiful, and so I loved that about this book as well. The characters though, the Fellowship, I connected to them so much this time around, and I didn't really the first time. I liked some of them. I really liked Aragorn the first time. I wanted to like Legolas a little more than I did. I didn't really know what to do with Gimli or Boromir, and I thought the hobbits were interesting, but like Sam and Frodo were the ones that I liked the best. I love them all now. I love this crew so much. I love how they're all so different and so fleshed out, and how they all have their own roles and their own likes and dislikes about whatever is happening to them and their own opinions. I loved this crew and reading about this fellowship. What I didn't know about the book is that the plot is really more of the Fellowship of the Ring coming together rather than being together for very long. And I am going to get a little bit more detailed, a little bit more spoilery in this one as well, so skip around if you need to, but most people have read this, so I want to be able to talk to the people who've read this. Also, you can wait for my regular wrap-ups because I don't go into spoilers for these days. I really enjoyed the story of the Fellowship coming together finally, and then breaking up. We get so little time with them all together, like on the journey, like after they leave with the elves, after they are really like heading towards Mordor, and I want more of them together, and I am fully invested in seeing where all of them go. The plot is slow, and that probably was also an issue for me at the age that I was trying to read this. But I was so invested with the whole journey for this book. I thought that it was paced slower, and my favorite parts of the book were once the plot really got going and we really started getting the Fellowship together and adding more characters. but at the same time, I enjoyed the journey the entire way through. At the same time, though, I do think that because we had that really slow part, this feels like a first third of a story, which it is. We know that, right? Like Lord of the Rings was supposed to be one book, it was split into 6, published as 6, and now it's commonly published as 3. And so this is really the first third of this giant epic that is supposed to be one book, right? And so I can definitely feel that in this book. Like, I do think that this is the perfect place to cut off if you were going to split the book anywhere. This is the first third, definitely. But at the same time, it does feel like the first third of a larger book because we take our time so much in the beginning to kind of get everything going. I gave this 4.5 stars. I gave Carmilla 5 stars if I didn't say. But I gave this 4.5 stars and I really, really enjoyed this book a lot, but I do think that I have the potential to like the others more because the plot is properly going now. And I did read this for over a month or almost a month or something like that because this first half was so slow. I enjoyed it every time I picked it up, but it was a slow going book. And so I'm hoping that the others will have better pacing with that. And then the final classic that I read this month was Kindred by Octavia Butler. So I'm not fully sure if this is considered a classic by the I don't know what standards people consider classics. I don't always know, especially with more modern books. This was published in 1977, I think. 1979. This was published in 79. And so it is kind of an older book for our time, but it's also not super old. It's not as old as those. But also, I think it deserves to be in my classics wrap up. I think this deserves to be a classic if it's not widely considered one already. And so I'm putting it in the classics wrap up. I consider it a classic. I think it is a classic for its genre and also otherwise. So this is a book, and I haven't been giving descriptions super much because Carmilla, I think all you need to know is it's a subversion of vampire tropes really going in, and then you can know more, a little bit more if you want. You can dig a little deeper if you want. But then Fellowship of the Ring, everyone knows. Lord of the Rings, taking that ring to Mordor. But Kindred requires a little bit more summary. So we follow a Black woman living in 1976 who is constantly and consistently yanked back in time every once in a while over the course of a week in her time back to the antebellum South. So she is yanked back in order to save the life of this, when she first meets him, young white boy, who she later finds out is one of her ancestors. We also find out that he is the son of a enslaver, and so he will inherit a plantation, and he is also effectively an enslaver. It's a very rough and brutal book. It is not for people who would be harmed by seeing racial violence, very brutal racial violence, go on in the antebellum South, because that is there. I will leave trigger warnings in the pinned comment, but yeah, that is definitely there with this book, so just go in warned. As I said, this is a brutal book. It is at times excruciating to read. It is always hard to read, and I thought the emotional labor of reading this book was very worth it. But obviously, some people's emotional labor reading this book are going to be far greater than mine. So obviously take care of yourself, check trigger warnings, etc. And the perspective, I think, is really important. I think that this book delved into some really complex issues from a complex perspective in such an effective way. Themes of power and who has it and how you take someone's power, and dehumanization and entitlement and white supremacy and historical ancestral memory and trauma that carries. I think that this book makes a lot of those themes very, very clear, and I think it would open the eyes of a lot of people, and also just provide a space to work through some of them. This is also just such an engaging read. Octavia Butler, I've said this many times, knows the craft of writing so well, because she did it so well. This is well plotted, always increasing with intensity in each episode that she goes back in time, and it is always going where it needs to go. The characters are interesting, you get to know them, you feel for them, you hurt for them, and then some others you hate and dislike and can recognize their complexity and their narrative point, but also you hate them. Nothing is not complex in this book. Everything is delved into with a very sensitive to detail kind of way. I thought the pacing of this book, despite being like split up into different intervals, like each time she goes back, is some are slightly longer, some are slightly shorter, some are really short, some are really long. Even though that was the way this book is told, I felt the pacing was perfect until the end. I did think the end came a little bit quickly and it didn't answer all the questions I had. I don't know that, like, the way we begin the book is supposed to be the same place we end it, and it didn't quite get there for me, and I didn't feel like I got everything that went on. But I also I've been reading this for my fantasy class as well, same class I read Carmilla for, and so I feel like upon talking about this book on Tuesday, I might feel a little differently. Yeah, I just wanted a couple more things resolved more fully. But this is a phenomenal book. I highly recommend it if you think you can handle it. It is an amazing book. I've seen Octavia Butler say that she feels like the genre of fantasy fits its best, and so I'm gonna call it fantasy. That's why I called it fantasy. It's a very different type of fantasy than like the Lord of the Rings or something, but I think it, just as much deserves that genre. That's what Octavia Butler saw it as. But yeah, I highly recommend this one. These are the classics that I read this month. Thank you for watching my classics wrap up, and I will see you next time. Bye.